The 2020 global pandemic may have hit pause on in-person gatherings, but as I have stressed to my congregation, church isn't canceled and it isn't closed. We're simply worshiping in new ways and new places. And if you're like the vast majority of United Methodist churches, it means that you now have entered the world of live streaming for the first time. And that's what we're talking about on today's episode of the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast. Thank you to everybody for listening. My name is Dan Wunderlich. I'm a United Methodist pastor. And before we jump into today's episode, I want to share a special opportunity with you. We're approaching the end of an unprecedented year where we are all no doubt learning and growing and being stretched in ways we could never have imagined. Well, we want to hear from you. What have you learned this year? It can be something big or small, conceptual or practical, personal or technical. Email us your story, the things you've learned at podcast@umcom.org to share. And we have something special that we're planning. Okay, on to today's show. Our guest is Kathryn Price. Kathryn is a video producer at United Methodist Communications. Kathryn, thanks so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Let's begin by having you share a bit about yourself and what you do for United Methodist Communications.
Sure. So I grew up in the church. My dad is a pastor and he's worked in the church in various ways. And I work at UMCom. I'm in the production department. I have a background in art and graphic design. So I do a lot of the explainer videos and motion graphics videos. And for live events, I usually work on the graphics for those. And then I'm also the assistant director of production for General Conference.
That's awesome. That's a lot of really big responsibilities.
Yeah, it's a variety.
Well, we've heard a lot of people talk about this pandemic being an accelerator of trends, particularly on a tech level. And so no doubt as a video and graphics and motion graphics person, you probably have, your dad and other churches coming to you saying, Kathryn, please help us. And so we are grateful to have you here to help all of our churches and ministries that are listening. And, I consider myself a somewhat tech savvy pastor, but even live streaming was something on my radar to learn and implement like down the road. But
Yeah.
man, that point down the road has come up quick, hasn't it?
Yes, it has for, I think, everyone.
I vividly remember the evening of Friday, March the 13th. I think a lot of us do, or perhaps the next Friday. Whenever it is, we all made the call to move to worship online. The NBA had shut down. College basketball conference tournaments were shutting down. Our school district announced that they were extending spring break by a week. And we found ourselves with about 40 hours to figure out how to stream something that resembled worship. And while we've tweaked a few things over the following weeks, that initial setup and approach, that was essentially what we used until the middle of August. And it worked, but it definitely wasn't what we would have done had we actually had lead time to plan it strategically. And I know many of our listeners are probably looking for some super practical tips and recommendations, and we have those coming later. But Kathryn, you have a couple areas that you're encouraging us to think about a bit more conceptually. And so before we get into the list, can you just talk a bit for a minute about why a conceptual approach and maybe taking a step back and looking at things from 30,000 feet might be more important now than like specifically what camera we're using?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people are like what you described, were really overwhelmed and really caught off guard with how quickly they needed to scramble and figure things out. And it didn't really give them a lot of time to evaluate whether or not that was a good approach
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
whether that was going to actually serve their congregation in the way that they needed to, especially in such a, I don't know, emotional time for a lot of people. So my first thought is show up, don't show off,
Mm,
because there's not really any point stressing about your virtual worship being perfect because
yeah.
it won't be.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of technology. And especially moving into online worship so quickly, it just gets overwhelming. And once you start worrying too much about that, then you start losing that human connection and the personal connection of what church is supposed to be. And
Mm,
there's this movie, Chocolat, that I love. And one of the lines in it is, don't worry so much about supposed to. And I think that's
mm,
a great thing to think about here because don't worry so much about what you think church is supposed to be like or what worship was supposed to be like when you're in the sanctuary. Worry about connecting with your members virtually in whatever kind of digital space that is for your church. It doesn't have to be big and grand and fancy. It's whatever is going to reach out to your people. And I think it's just more important to offer something and be willing to laugh through the technical
Yeah.
difficulties together
Yeah.
than to not be offering anything at all, because people are going to appreciate that opportunity to connect and be together regardless of what the screen looks like or how many graphics are on there.
Yeah.
And then there's so many like simple solutions, like even just a phone. If you have a small congregation, picking up the phone and calling each member is plenty. And like that's a really great way to connect to people because almost everyone definitely has a phone.
Absolutely. Yeah, we had our staff call down our member list a couple times every month or so, and people were just so appreciative. Even if all they got was a voicemail, the next time we reached out to them, they were grateful to hear. And you're
Yeah.
right, technical difficulties can be laughed off, especially if this is your first time through all this. If this were 5 years down the road, and people might get annoyed, but I think people have a lot of grace at least this summer.
Yeah, for sure. And because they're probably having to do that on in a lot of different ways on
Yeah.
their end as well.
For me to try to generate some ideas of what is possible. I watched other church live streams, but I try to watch some stuff outside of the church world to learn, what other people are doing. And so I'll
Yeah.
jump on something like Twitch or similar platforms, and you end up watching like gamers who stream from their bedrooms. And I even found a guy who lives in Japan. He makes like traditional wood block prints by hand, and like a couple times a week he streams himself carving wood blocks. And I can't stop watching. It's just so compelling, and he doesn't have slick graphics. He doesn't have transitions. He's like 68 years old. He just turns the camera on and he tells stories and he does something that's engaging. And we theoretically, have the most engaging and important story to tell. And, so of course, we're not saying don't try to make your stream look good and sound as good as you can, but there's also a tipping point where the amount of polish we're trying to add doesn't actually convert to connection.
Yeah, like I wouldn't say just give up and turn worship into an email because
Yeah,
that's nobody if we already get enough emails, nobody wants to read another email.
right.
So the next thing that I would say is along that same line is remember your audience. Remember who you are worshiping with and trying to speak to, and don't let all the technology overshadow the fact that it's always been and still is all about relationships, and being
Yeah.
online doesn't change that. And if you're spending all your time trying to get the live stream to work and making sure everything goes perfectly, it's going to leave less time for you to engage with your members and less time for you to really want to engage with your members. You're going to be
Hmm.
so fed up with the live stream that you just want to be quiet and be in a room by yourself. So, and then likewise, people, if your online service is difficult to get to or difficult to access or just complicated, on the user end, then it's going to discourage members from even wanting to participate because it's such a
Yeah.
chore, and they're going to resort to their own thing because they just don't feel like they're even connected or being thought about. So plan your worship around that audience and the gear that you have, and create an atmosphere that aligns with what your congregation's style and values already are. If you haven't been super technological in the past, maybe you don't really need to be right now. Like
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
church, we don't have screens with lyrics or anything on them. So when they started doing digital or online church, they didn't really add that to it. They kept it similar to what it already was. It was just we were watching it on a screen rather than in
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
So, and then when you're doing that, like during the worship stream, make sure you're remembering that your audience is sitting at home and like
Yeah.
watching a screen. So be sure to use the chat and welcome each person and reply to comments and turn those comments into a conversation or a direct message, and just treat everybody like you would as if you're seeing them in person on a Sunday morning.
That's so true because I think perhaps some of the more challenging transitions have been churches that usually rely on like 30 to 45 minutes worth of music, and like
Yeah.
even the people who are sing in their car, and if they're streaming worship from home on the couch, they're going to sing along. There comes a point in time where it just does not work as well if you're sitting on your couch than if you're in an auditorium with the lights dimmed and a big sound system. And so remembering to like what is it like for someone sitting on the couch watching this, and
Yeah.
prepare the experience that way.
And the other stuff that's, like, going around them at their house, like, you don't know
Yeah,
if they're being distracted in other ways, so you wanna keep them
exactly.
engaged.
Yeah. Yeah, we did a pre-recorded service one week. We've been doing it live, and we'll talk in a minute about pre-recording. But I found myself folding laundry, and I'm like, well,
Yeah.
technically, I heard the sermon because I gave the sermon, but still, like, this is if this is something that people can have on in the background, and it's not as engaging. And like you said, I think a lot of us, like, as particularly in the Methodist church, where sometimes we can get called the frozen chosen or whatever, like, we think in church you're supposed to sit and you don't talk.
Mhm.
And so, like, the chat dies, when really, like, the chat, if you're like on Facebook or YouTube live, like, that is a way to actually get people to participate, because when they're not standing up and sitting down, and they're not coming forward for communion, or they're not, physically active, it literally becomes something you can listen to in the background.
Yeah, and, like, even when you're in church, I know you're probably not talking. I mean, I know that me personally, sometimes I'm, like, whispering to my mom or something and saying, like, "Oh, that was good." But you're also like, some people clap during stuff, so, like, they're still engaged and they still make noise, and so that's sort of the same thing with the chat. Like, that's just
Yeah.
a virtual way of clapping and whispering to each other.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, we make those comments to each. Trust me, as a preacher who sees what you're doing while I'm preaching,
Yeah.
you are talking. You can just now do that in the chat. Well, we did preview this a bit. So talk to us about true live versus pre-recorded worship.
Yeah, so I think most people have probably figured out this by now, but doing a true live stream can take a lot of unnecessary time and
Yeah.
stress, both for rookies and pros, and it can just be a lot. And if you already have the means and capability to do that, that is super great and keep doing that. But if you don't be a hero, record your service ahead of time. Because most of the streaming platforms, even the free ones, they'll let you upload a video and then you schedule it when you want it to premiere live. So it'll appear as if it's live. Everybody will be watching it together and still be able to chat, but you will not be worried about it not actually happening because you've already done it. So you already
Yeah.
know it exists in the world. And then you can save the true live, because I know the true live streaming moments are still cool and still fun. And
Yeah.
being able to do, because when you do a pre-recording, you don't have that take questions from the audience moment or anything. But that goes back to remembering your audience. Remember that they're watching this, and so leave space in that worship for people to comment their prayer requests
Hmm. Hmm.
or anything like that. And you can save true live streaming moments for like lower stakes things like video announcements or weekly check-in or a weekly devotion, and just like smaller moments. And you could even, like, on the day that you are pre-recording your worship, you could have a live stream that's sort of like a behind the scenes of worship service, so people
Yeah.
can be a
Yeah.
part of the process. And that way you still have that live connection or the live interaction, and in real time in some ways, but then you're freed up to engage in the chat and actually enjoy the spiritual meditation of worship along
Yeah.
with everybody else who's watching that morning or whenever you have your service.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Like I said, we do True Live, and we don't have, as some more well-known non-Methodist preachers out there, we don't have a giant TV monitor scrolling the live comments as we're going, and so I can't participate in the conversation. Where if it's the 1 or 2 weeks where we did pre-record, even during my own sermon, I'm in the chat, like, asking questions and kind
Yeah.
of responding to myself and being able to connect with folks, not being like, preach on, preacher, you're so good, but like, like, hey, this is something, honestly, like, I've struggled with. I'm not just putting this on for show. And it does give you the chance to really do ministry on two different levels at the same time.
Yeah, and that's something that doesn't happen in in-person church.
Right.
So that's something that is really only possible and has only come out of streaming it online, is having the ability to talk to the preacher at the same time as watching the sermon.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very meta.
Well, your final big picture challenge is one that we will approach both here and in our technical conversation, and that is what it means to invest in digital ministry. So, before we get into the specifics of technology, when we look at the 30,000 foot level, or maybe even just the people side of things, what does investing in digital ministry look like, and what do we need to prepare sort of ourselves as those who are in charge for?
Yeah, so I think that you should be approaching your online ministry with the exact same care and intentionality you do for in-person ministry, because people don't always come to church every week, even when you are in in-person worship and you're not only online. Like some people just can't come every week, and visitors want to know what to expect before they show up. So
Right.
having a digital presence is a must-have. And I know we were all really thrown into this cyberspace like immediately and with no warning and
Yeah.
no end in sight. But I do think that that is what it took for people, especially churches, to realize the importance of having a digital presence and also to understand the workload that is involved in developing and maintaining that
Hmm.
digital presence, because it is not, I mean, it's a full-time job. And
Yeah.
for a lot of people, like those working from home, I know for me especially, I just have a hard time like turning it off, and like
Yes.
I just feel
Hmm.
like I'm doing even more work because it's online, just because there's so many other things involved. So now that the initial shock has worn off, it's important to step back and take time to develop a vision for how you're going to continue your online ministry now, like even as we're still only an online ministry, and figure out how it's going to coexist once you do open your doors, because it cannot end once the pandemic ends. So, how will
Right.
you transition from creating digital ministry as a placeholder to treating it as part of your normal outreach and juggling it along with your in-person ministry every week? Maybe you're not continuing the full-on live worship streaming, but there may be other digital virtual things that you do keep, and those are going to take and require resources like time,
Yeah.
energy, care, people, attention. So it's really important to just like figure out what you can support feasibly, and what level of production you really can commit to and sustain for the long haul. I just think it's better to do less and do it well than to take on too much and it sort of all be mediocre or poor. It's sort of like the jack of all trades, master of none thing.
Right. Right. Right.
So yeah, I just think making a digital ministry plan, creating a budget for it, because yes, technology will cost money.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you haven't been keeping it updated, it might cost more money than you expect. And and then put it into action now, because there's no reason, like you need to go ahead and have all of that in place so that when people do start showing back up, you aren't scrambling again to make it more efficient so that you can manage both.
That's so true. And I mean, you mentioned like the end of the pandemic. Like, obviously, number one, we don't know when it is, but it's also not going to be like, okay, we've decided
Yeah.
February 13th is going to be the end of the pandemic. Like, even now, churches that have reopened, all the statistics are showing that, attendance is not rebounding.
Right, yeah.
Churches are like 40%, or lower of what they're used to. There are people who are going to keep watching online. And
Mhm.
I hope other churches have experienced the blessing we have of having people outside our geographical area joining in. And, obviously I want those folks to connect with an in-person community near them. But if we can be a blessing to them, we have our, snowbirds who are now able to watch us when they're not down here. We have folks that have joined, that took the new member class that have never met us in person. And they found us online during this
Yeah,
time.
that's
Like,
wild.
it is, and particularly for a church, like we've always been really welcoming, which is what every church says they are, but like we actually are. Like that is our strength. And so when we went online, I was like, oh my gosh, like we lost our thing, but it's like no, we didn't. It's just you have to do it in a new way.
Mhm.
So awesome. Well, Kathryn, now that you have us thinking about our conceptual approach to live streaming, we're going to jump to some technical details, and that's coming up right after this break.
Are you still serving your local church in a leadership role? Ministry would suffer without dedicated members and leaders like you. We want to continue to support your vital work. Please update your information with United Methodist Communications to ensure that you'll receive the latest information about services and resources, such as grants and training opportunities relevant to your leadership role at church. Update your information at umc.org/update. Act now and receive a complimentary registration for the Digital Media for Ministry online course, a $19.99 value. Thank you. And now back to our program.
Now, Kathryn, as we turn to the tech side, I'll start by saying it is always a double-edged sword to get too into detail with technology, because whether it's equipment or services or apps, this stuff changes literally all the time. I mean, we have done episodes on Facebook where a feature we explain changes before the episode publishes. That's just how the nature of technology, and particularly now as the market for church live streaming has blown wide open, I have a sneaking suspicion we're going to see some advancements and new products and services come along over the next little bit. But we are here to be as helpful as we can for those of you who are listening along with us. So let's get into it. Your first technical recommendation regards something we might easily overlook, but is so critical. I mean, it's literally the foundation to getting
Yes.
worship out, and that's our internet connection.
Yes, and exactly like what you just said, Wi-Fi, I think it's Wi-Fi 6, like, just came out and just
Mm,
happened, like, during this, pandemic. So, internet for sure, like, if your router if you bought that, like, even if it was, like, over 5 years ago, like, it probably can't even handle the
yeah.
type of technology that you are going to need. So and, like, every single article that you'll read online about best things for live streaming, it always says camera, audio, lighting. It never says internet connection.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is just like, it does not matter how great your camera is if your internet connection is weak and unreliable, because that is what drives the quality of your live stream. I personally am just, I would rather have no internet than slow internet. It drives me
Mm-hmm.
insane when I have a slow internet connection. There's like a quote from, I think, Will Ferrell, who said, the best way to get to know someone before you marry them is put them in front of a computer with slow internet. And like, that is so true. Like, I want to throw my computer out the window. And I think that it's just that we need to shift our mindset away from thinking of internet as a luxury and think of it as an essential. It's, to me, it's a modern day utility. It's gas, water, electricity, internet. Like, that is just part of it. And when you're live streaming, especially because live streaming requires a lot of bandwidth and it's going to take up almost all of it. The uploading speed is not what is advertised, because the
Right.
uploading speed is way lower than what you would expect. But you do need to check it, because that is what causes, like, when you see a video buffering, it's because the resolution of the video is too high for the bandwidth to handle. And so
Yeah.
it's having to catch up, and like, it just isn't going to work. So you need to test that out beforehand. I don't want to like bring math into this, but like, if you get like a speed test app, that'll tell you what your upload speed is, and then you can sort of backtrack it to figure out how to export your video, or
Yeah.
what resolution to shoot your video in so that it will play correctly on your internet. But again, if you haven't updated your internet devices in a while, you're not going to be able to get much out of it. You're going to have to invest in a better one, because it just doesn't have the capacity for the current world.
Yeah. Yeah. My
So
wife and I kept our like college Wi-Fi router for so long just because we kept moving and it was like, whatever, it still works. And then when we got a new one, we just could not believe how much faster and more reliable it
oh my
was.
gosh, I
A-
know.
And you're so right. Upload speed is completely different than download speed. Like if you go to like fast.com, which is like Netflix's way, their website for you measuring the speed of that has nothing to do with whether your service is going to go up or not.
Uh-huh.
That is download only. And again, as you mentioned, like if you, particularly if you are going live, like true live, if you are stuck, you can always lower the resolution in the output
Yeah.
program, whether you use an OBS or some other streaming program. Like you don't need to be going 1080p 60 frames a second if your internet can't handle it. Which
Yeah, and
again, those are
especially if people are watching it on a computer. Like,
yeah,
that's the other thing, is that I know that, like, 4K is, like, all the rage and everything, but very few people and very few computers even exist that can let you watch 4K. So, there's no point in, streaming that way. There's no, like, if someone's watching on a computer, the screen can only be so big.
yeah,
So, don't
exactly.
worry about, like, the highest quality, because 'cause you're not showing this in a theater.
Yeah, yeah, so true. All right, so next, you recommend that we look into apps and services that can help us actually manage our virtual church.
Yeah, so I think this would apply specifically for people or for churches who are doing live stream a lot and like are really going to be continue doing their worship services live. I personally haven't ever used any of these apps, but I definitely see the benefit of them, especially because of the stress of trying to handle all the different things that are
Yeah.
involved. And so having it all under one roof could be really helpful and efficient for a staff. And like a lot of the services, they will offer things like 24-hour tech support, the ability to like have the video on your website and still have a chat going. They'll even sometimes provide the right equipment that you need or advise you on how to actually hook up your equipment so that it works correctly. So just like little things like that that could be stressful if you're having to do them every single week and you always seem to run into trouble. I think having an app or service that actually manages all of that for you and keeps it all together is very helpful. And there are some that are also like specifically for churches, and they have like online bulletins, e-giving, interactive Bible resources. So that can be, if that's something that you do and that you are prioritizing, that might be a really good thing. But if you are working with the free platforms like Facebook and YouTube, might also just be everything you need. Like you might not need to upgrade. So it's just one of those things that you have to think about when you're planning your long-term digital ministry plan. Is that something that you need to look into or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of it is based on the size of your congregation or your community itself.
Yeah.
So certain streaming platforms and programs can only output to one source at a time, and you might need to subscribe to a service that can send it to multiple places.
Right.
But there's also not really a point in sending it to multiple places if 95% of your congregation is going to watch it on Facebook, and YouTube is just going to
Yeah.
be people clicking in and out.
Yeah, and the multicasting, it kind of, I mean, I get it. I understand the value of it, especially if you're a really large church and you want to meet people where they are on a platform that they already use. But I
Mhm.
also like being able to have everybody in one spot and like,
Yeah.
because it's sort of like if you were to be having your worship service in person and everybody's sitting in a different room. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah.
you don't really get the same feeling of like being together and experiencing it together. So,
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, it's definitely, it depends on the size of your church.
Yeah. And just even outside of apps and programs, just creating a system for follow up with folks. I mean, counting digital attendance is the most frustrating and honestly like depressing part of
Yeah.
it, because we're turning in our missional vital signs to the Florida conference, and our worship attendance is like the little number next to the eyeball on Facebook. And it's like, I
Oh,
know that, like some of those
our
houses have
families.
4 or 5 people, and then some of them are one. And I know some of them are only popping in for a couple minutes. And generally we try to grab like the 1 minute video views about 24 hours later, because now folks aren't just watching it on Sunday morning. They might watch it Sunday afternoon or
Mhm.
evening or whatever. But even then, it's like that is just not a super reliable number. And now we're getting off into the weeds. But I guess all that to say is like, come up with a system that you feel at least you can keep consistent, because as things start to ramp back up, all of these folks, volunteers or staff members that, have had emptier plates, those plates are going to fill back up again. And so you need to
Yeah.
like work the kinks out of the system now. At least that's what we're working on at my church.
Yeah, our church started doing sort of like like the member sign-in. We always had like
Right.
a member sign-in book, but they started doing it online. So like at the beginning of the worship service when the music is playing, they had either a link or like a website URL for people to go to like check in and just say,
Hmm.
this is how many people are watching today. And so because yeah, that the number on the Facebook viewing is just like so different
Yeah.
if like there are a bunch of families watching, because it's just gonna seem like, oh well, this is a very intimate group today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's like little ways you can get around this. So yes, you can set up, if particularly if you have something like Planning Center, which is a very popular church management system. They have the
Hmm.
Church Center app that folks can check themselves in on. We like literally I say during the greeting, post in the comments that you're watching, who you're watching with, where you're
Hmm.
watching from, and we post it as this like fun thing, but like haha, secretly we're taking attendance. Like that's what we're
We
doing.
have an
So
ulterior motive.
yeah, yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the tech side of investing in technology, and this is maybe the main event that folks have been scrubbing through the whole podcast to get to. Hopefully not. Hopefully they've been with us the whole time. But how do we take the long view when we're investing in specific technology and production tools?
Yeah, so technology is, I think, still an area that a lot of churches do not prioritize in their budgets. So because of that, it's stuff that they really haven't updated that regularly. I feel like it's like the way I am with my car. I'm like, I'm going to drive that car into the ground. I'm never
Yeah.
going to spend a dime on it until it dies. But if you treat technology like that, and like that, I know that's impractical because I drive my car every day. So like I should really be supporting it more. But with technology, it's the same way. If you're just waiting for it to die and you're like, well, this works, I'm not going to replace it. It is just going to be so frustrating once you do have to upgrade it, because it's going to become obsolete very quickly. It probably already is.
Yeah.
And then you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I don't have this type of money. I haven't ever budgeted for any of this. And yeah, it's going to be a lot, but it is so important. And it will help you, like, in the long run. It's going to go a lot farther than you really think. And it's going to make a lot of things just easier to adapt to, because you already have that there. So once you already have the stuff in your church and in your room or whatever, you're going to be able to be more creative and more resourceful and figure out new ways to use it. And so that's the other thing about not buying stuff. I know it's really easy right now to impulse buy gear
Yeah.
that is going to work for the temporary solutions that we all put in place really quickly. But those may not actually you probably aren't going to be able to sustain those over time, or they're just not going to work over time. Like, is something that's working right now with nobody in the church might not actually work once people are in the church. So then you're
Right.
going to have to buy something else. And it's also how I am with stuff in my kitchen. Like, I just hate having a utensil that only does one thing. I
Right.
like everything to have like multiple uses, because it's a space saver. I don't know, it's just efficient and nice. And yeah, it's a multi-tool. Everything is a multi-tool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like, again, it goes back to like really taking the time to figure out where you're going with your technology, what you can commit to. Maybe you decide that videos and creating online content is the thing that you want to do, and the thing that really is serving your church. So you decide to create a permanent video shoot corner in your church that you just keep set up all the time so that you can jump in and record quick videos. So what gear are you going to need to have that and keep it there? And then if you aren't recording a video at that moment, you may be able to use that for other things. Or maybe you continue doing live streams on a weekly basis, like short ones or whatever. And what gear are you going to need for that? So, or maybe you're not even worried about, maybe after all this, you're going to really focus on your website and the blog, and and that's as much of a digital presence as your church really needs. And so you are going to focus your production needs on in-person church. That is still something that you need to budget for, and you need to up that technology and keep it updated so that you don't get stuck again if something happens, and it's just going to serve you for a lot longer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I say this very hopefully gently. My church did not choose to do drive-in church, but a lot of churches in our conference did choose to do that. And I just have this vision of closets full of FM transmitters that have been used for 6 months and are going to sit in the closet for the rest of eternity. And like, maybe maybe you borrowed yours from a congregation member who runs a little pirate radio station, or maybe you bought it off eBay used, or you got a good deal, or maybe like it was the absolute right investment for your church at the time. But I'm just seeing so many churches making such short-term
Hmm.
investments that aren't small. I mean, it's like
Right.
there is very little technology that is super cheap that's going to last you a long time, which that's a tough thing to hear, but it's the truth.
Yeah, technology is one of those things that you get what you pay for. And if you do not invest in it properly, you're not gonna really enjoy it.
Right.
And like stuff like the FM transmitter things, like, also in America, it's about to be winter. So like people aren't really gonna want to sit in their car running the heat up either way, like whether there's a
Right.
transmitter or not.
Right, right, exactly. And like you said, like keep in mind that particularly if you are filming with no one there will eventually be people there. So like that setup I said we used until August, it was literally my personal cell phone and my personal iPad plugged into my personal laptop on cafe tables 5 feet in front of us. That will not fly with people in the
Yeah.
congregation.
That
It
would really
gave
take
a
away from the experience.
Yeah. I mean, it created an incredibly intimate experience for those first couple months, and people were like, "This is great. Like, we can see your facial expressions even better than when we're live." But that's not going to work when people are back.
Yeah.
And again, we've mentioned a lot of folks are not going to come back for a while. There are also people whose, as much as we probably hate to hear this, like their habits are changed, and they are now going to be
Right.
primarily online viewers no matter what you do. And we can't pull the rug out from under those folks. So, let's just for a second, can you give us your thoughts on cameras? Because there are a couple different styles of cameras we can use. Our church somehow miraculously had one of those pan tilt zoom robo cameras already, and that's what we've shifted toward. But we're
Hmm.
looking to buy a second camera so that it doesn't look like you're watching worship through like a security camera that's like, robotically panning in the middle of service. But we've got camcorders, we've got DSLRs. Maybe some places, if you have a separate audio system, you can use a smartphone. And then you also have these robotic cameras. Can you maybe walk us through like a rubric of assessing what might or might not be good for our spaces and needs?
Sure. Yeah. It definitely depends on the size and the scale of your worship and the worship that you want to stream. So, like for super small churches, maybe a high end web camera is really all you need.
Hmm,
And in fact, I would say a high end web camera really is a great investment for all size churches because you can get so many uses out of it. You can use it for
yeah,
worship, or you can use it for making personal check in phone calls on Zoom. It's just like you can really get your money's worth out of a high end webcam. And if you have a small sanctuary and your live streaming, especially right now, is very intimate, a high end web camera is going to really up everything, and you won't have to do too much to
yeah,
make it look great. But for like mid-size churches, if you're using a single camera, I would say a DSLR or an HD camcorder will be fine. The thing that I think about those is that video cameras are built to shoot video. So if
yeah,
you're going to be shooting video, I think you should get a video camera. But DSLRs are great if they are being set up and if it's like a low light situation, or if it's just like a shaky lighting situation,
yeah,
because they are just better in those conditions. But you have to remember that those are not great for like moving around a lot because they're meant to be set, stay still, and then
right.
reset. So, and then for either one, you just need to make sure that the outputs that they have will are compatible with your other gear. So, most of the DSLRs now they're able to they have the connections to be able to be used as your webcam, and because that's what you really want to do, especially for your streaming service, like with your streaming service. So you just need to make sure you don't need any extra gear or anything in order to hook it up that way. So that's a more important thing than like a brand or a model of camera, is just making sure those connectors are going to work for what you're doing.
Yeah, and let me just jump in. Like, if you're looking at a model, search that model and the word streaming. Like, we bought
Mhm.
a really nice DSLR a year ago because all we thought we would be doing is like videos, YouTube videos, announcement videos, things like
Mhm.
that. And now we're streaming. We're like, great. Well, we've got this really great camera. Well, number one, the HDMI out, it mirrors the screen on the back of the camera. So all like the battery logo and the focus box and like
Oh.
all of that information on your camera comes out. And then also, they had just put out a utility to remove all that. The sensor in the camera overheats and burns out if you use it for longer than 30 minutes.
Oh,
So like if
no.
I'm yeah, it's not built for long video shoots. And
Mhm.
so here we have this great camera with excellent, like, the image looks amazing, but it is not at all a streaming camera. So just yeah, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, yeah, that's the other thing with video cameras. They just are built to record for longer. Like, you could
Yeah,
record for, like, 8 hours on a video camera, and a DSLR, I'm pretty sure they all max out at 30 minutes. Like, you have to stop and restart, and it'll say, "Camera's overheating, you can't
yeah,
do it until later."
right.
So, yeah, I mean, those are just again, it depends on what you're trying to do,
Hmm,
because maybe that is all you need if you're doing YouTube videos and
right,
shorter clips, but
right.
then if you are doing, like what you said, multi-camera setups, either 3 or 4 or even just 2, I think the most feasible thing personnel-wise is to have robotic cameras, just because it reduces the amount of people you need running them.
Right.
Because for every single PTZ camera, you have to have someone at that camera operating it and making sure the speaker stays in the frame and that everything's in focus. And with the robotics, if you have somebody who knows how to set them up and use them, that's all you just need one person.
Right.
So the price is obviously going to be a big factor in that, because as you start adding more cameras, the price is going to go up really drastically. And then you also need things like camera cards and cables and I mean, there's just so many other accessories that go along with all of this. And then for both setups, if you're doing PTZ cameras or robotics, also need somebody who is operating the computer, where it's
Right.
streaming and the switcher,
Right.
so that you can cut between the shot. So yeah, it's a lot of different factors will go into it. But generally, I would say the best rule of thumb is prepare yourself to spend some money
Yeah.
because it is important, and that's why it's important to develop that production plan, because you're going to need to spend some money, and you need to figure out what you need to spend money on now and what you plan to spend money on in the future. Because
Mhm.
right now, as we're still online, you could start invest in some of those cameras now that you're still going to use later. So that way, whenever you do get to later, then you can start figuring out, okay, now what is going to help us juggle this in person and online? What's going to make that more efficient? And what can we buy now that we've already invested in our main gear? So,
Yeah.
and because like a mid range camera, I mean, I think you can find some good HD cameras for about $800, maybe. That would be the lowest. I
Right.
mean, you could spend $2,000 just on one camera if you're like really going for the high end stuff. And then you have all the accessories that go with it, SD cards and everything, and like a tripod. You definitely need a tripod for every single type of camera. So yeah, it's just going to be a lot of investing and like understanding that you're going to have, like, there's no way around it.
Right. And this isn't true in every church, but it's true in a lot of churches. And particularly if you, and I know a lot of pastors know this, but if you're the tech person or you're the comms person at your church, I want you to know from a pastor's perspective, there are people likely in your congregation who would rather invest in something specific. Like there are some people who maybe don't tithe regularly, don't give regularly, but they love investing in specific
Absolutely.
projects. And particularly, and I want this to come across as like this is giving someone a chance to invest in ministry that they care about. If you have maybe some older folks who have money to give and who can't or won't be able to come in person for a while, this could be an
Mm-hmm.
opportunity for them to invest in something that is going to directly impact them. And then even further, if you take Kathryn's advice and you make a plan for equipment that you can use that is a multi-tool. You say this camera is going to be Sunday morning, but it's also going to help us reach your grandchildren when we film TikToks in the middle
Mm-hmm.
of the week, or whatever it is. Like if you can present to people who are interested in investing in specific things that you have a well thought out plan that is also flexible and will help the ministry. I really hope and pray that there are people in your congregation that can help you with this. I don't want you to hear the $800 to $2,000 price tag and just think, well, I wasted my time. Why did I listen to this conversation? We can't
Yeah.
afford that. Like,
Yeah, that's a really good point.
if you're a church that is making a difference in the community outside of worship, there may be people who are outside of your church who will help you with stuff like this. You just ask and you shall
Yeah,
hopefully
and right
receive.
now a lot of people are upgrading. And so some people
Mhm.
who have been maintaining their technology may be upgrading from already really good things. They just want a better
Yeah.
one, or they just are able to afford a better one. So you might still be able to get
Yeah.
good deals on used things. Like I am not above buying used equipment. I think used gear is just as great as long as it's still compatible with the current age. Like don't buy a
Right.
Polaroid
Right.
camera right now. But like, I don't know, buying a camera that's 3 or 4 years old, you might still be okay. I would probably, I mean, you really just need to do your research, but I would say maybe 2 years old is the safest bet. But yeah, don't be afraid to buy used gear, because I mean, used gear means it's worn in and you know whether it works or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also have a note here
Oh my gosh,
about
yeah.
audio because we can get so distracted by the quality of our video and does it zoom properly and all these things. And then you forget that the microphone on a camera that is 100 feet away at the back of your
I
sanctuary is
mean,
not
yeah,
going to
it's
do
basically
diddly
pointless.
squat.
Like if you the audience is way more forgiving of bad video than bad audio. Like just think about if you've ever seen like a bootleg movie, you may not be able to see the screen that well, but if you can hear it, you're kind of okay. If you can't hear it, then you're like, why am I even watching this? So like your audio
Right.
system in your sanctuary might be enough, and it might can plug into your camera or the computer, the streaming device, but you do need to test it. But if somebody's talking, the audio matters. So make sure that whoever is speaking is either wearing a mic that's connected to the live stream, or if you don't have a mic, then you need to place your camera as close to the speaker as possible. because that's the only way you're going to get good audio, and that's the only way people are going to hear the message. And so don't
Right.
discount, like, you need to be thinking about audio equally along with your video, because it really creates the whole immersive experience. And online, especially as you were saying, with people doing things in the background, like, they are only able to do that if they can hear it. So,
Right.
if they can't hear it and they can only see it, I don't know that they're gonna stay tuned in for the whole time.
No, no, definitely not. Well, let's talk about technical glitches. We can laugh off delays in camera switching or mics with dead batteries. We've all done that in person, and no doubt we've done it online. We had a blackout for a second or two this last Sunday, and came back actually. And the next thing in worship was prayer, and so I said, "Let's pray together," which is what we've been doing for the last 30 seconds while we were trying to recover our stream. But it's not so funny when you come in on a Sunday morning and your
Mhm.
church internet is out, or some other major piece of equipment in the chain isn't working. And so, what recommendations do you have to create a solid backup plan?
Yeah, so the thing that I always think about is that you don't really have any control over the free platforms like Zoom and Facebook, and so if they go
Right.
out and they crash, it's not your fault, but you also can't do anything about it. And in the same way, it might be that somebody else at their house, their internet isn't working, or their feed just isn't able to stay with the live stream. So, having a backup plan for your video or for your live stream is a really great idea. So some churches may opt to do the multicasting like we talked about, but there's also services you can get that will let you use two internet connections at the same time and will stream over both of those. So that way, if one of them goes out,
Hmm.
you're not having that stutter in between. Like, I know, like, if you are using your phone and you switch from Wi-Fi to cellular, there's a little bit of a gap. And with a live stream, that doesn't just like
Right.
pick back up. Like, you might have to actually re-log in or something. So if you are doing your service and you've pre-recorded it, then a great backup is to just upload that video onto multiple platforms like Vimeo, your website, wherever. And then you're also having your live stream. And then if the live stream crashes, you have that link on hand that you can immediately send out to people, and they can still watch it. It won't be live streamed, but it will be more like on demand. But then at least they can still enjoy the worship. And then once the or once the stream does come back up, or the site comes back up, then you could do like a live post worship and just have like people
Yeah.
come back for prayer requests or whatever, just to have that real time interaction that you lost. Or you could have everything, you could have it also ready in an email and send that out to anybody who's having trouble with the live stream. Or if the stream crashes, that's how you get it to everybody. So it's just great to have a way to still get people to see it, even if it's not there on the live stream.
Yeah. And it would be a lot of extra work, but I almost wonder, particularly if you're a church doing live like we are, if it's worth it to record one full worship service that you just keep in your back pocket. Like, it's uploaded
Yeah.
somewhere and it's not in the flow of things. But if, heaven forbid, earlier this summer, the internet in one quarter of Orlando went out, and one of the major churches down there had to just basically film that morning and upload from
Oh,
home
man.
essentially, because they couldn't go live. That's probably, that's a lot of extra work to write an extra sermon, or maybe you can find something else to fill that sermon time just to have something. But I did want to point out, when you schedule Facebook Live, or even when you're getting ready to go live, there's a little checkbox under settings in the stream area, and I'm looking at it right now. It's called End Live Video if Stream Stops,
Oh,
and you want
yeah,
to
that's a good
uncheck
note.
that. That is automatically checked. Even if you uncheck it every time, it's not a setting that you can save, unfortunately. You need to go and uncheck that. That won't help you if Facebook crashes, but if you're streaming through another program like OBS or Ecamm Live or something, if that thing crashes and you haven't unchecked that, then you're sunk. You have to start a completely new stream, send people to a new link, all that jazz. But if you uncheck that box, even if your computer literally crashes, you can reboot it. That stream stays open. And someone on a cell phone can jump in the comments and say, "Sorry, technical difficulties, we'll be back in a
Oh,
minute." And it
yeah.
leaves that feed open. So that just is one small box that I always make sure we uncheck when we're
Yeah,
getting
that's a
ready
great
to go
note.
live.
And that's the other thing about like just relying on the free platforms. Like, I think they're great, and I think that's a really good thing to have for churches. But I just really like also having a website and because you have full control over that. And
Right.
like
Yeah.
no one is ever going
Yeah.
to shut that site down unless you just stop paying for it. But so I just really think that
Right.
making sure to, even if you upload your live streams afterwards onto your website so that people can watch them, I just think that's really important to have
Mhm.
have your home base be your website and not your Facebook page or something like that. Because when people search for it, if they can see everything on the Facebook page, which is or on your website, that's they're only looking at your stuff. They're not looking at Facebook, which has their friends and other things on there that they might
Right.
actually get distracted with and then forget, oh yeah, I actually came here to look at this church.
That is so true. That's so true. Well, Kathryn, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you, but this actually isn't goodbye. We have gone almost an hour. We'll see how long it goes when Josh, our editor, starts taking his razor blade to it. But as you can tell, Kathryn is a wealth of knowledge, and live streaming is on the front of all of our minds today. And certainly, especially now that worship is online, as sketch as this may sound, your worship service is a part of your church marketing. That's why we're talking about it here. This is part of how we connect with people. It's part of the stories that we tell. But of course, that isn't the only thing we do when it comes to video and audio. And video and audio for pre-recorded and pre-edited videos is a completely different animal than live streaming. So, Kathryn, you're going to join us next month, aren't you?
I sure am.
Awesome. Okay, now, listeners, we want to hear from you. How is your live streaming going? What's working? What tips would you recommend? And what do you want to learn more about? You can email us at podcast@umcom.org, and we just might share your thoughts on a future episode. And don't forget, you can use that email, podcast@umcom.org, to share what you've learned in this crazy year. We cannot wait to hear from you. Finally, if you found this podcast to be helpful and you'd like to make sure other church communicators like yourself find this resource, the two biggest things you can do are to share this episode with your friends and colleagues and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or whatever service you're listening to us on right now. Thanks again for listening to the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast.